Ritual on the bench. Guards shoved the condemned across the polished boards while candles guttered along the bench. The condemned cuffed, palms raw where the rope had bitten. Fear tightened his throat and forced his jaw closed. The magistrate raised the sealed parchment and said, "By order of the crown, the law will be fulfilled." The dismemberer set a leather-bound tool roll on the table and tapped his hammer twice. The courtroom smelled of tallow and wet wool. Within those 5 sentences the problem stood plain. The court would remove a limb to make a lesson, and every hand in the room would either force that removal or watch it as evidence. The narrator kept distance and record. He wrote facts: the age of the condemned, the citation on the parchment, the names and seals on the warrant. He noted the bench's height, the magistrate's robe thread, the executioner's gauntlets. He recorded the law invoked and the precedent cited out loud by the magistrate. Those details established context without judgment. In voice measured and detached, he put the setting. Late evening in a royal courtroom, and the verdict already read. The magistrate spoke again. "Record the sentence," he said. "Let the limb hang as warning." He spoke in the smooth baritone attributed to him. The words were formal and deliberate. The condemned tried to answer and coughed a plea. "Mercy," he said, voice thin. The magistrate did not look at him. The dismemberer inspected the tools with the same ritual precision he used before every formal procedure. He wiped his glove on his apron and opened a folded cloth that revealed wedge-shaped steels and axes with sharpened edges. The dismemberer's hands were broad. He flexed fingers once and hissed under his breath, the sound short and private. Guards tightened the rope. One guard, a man the narrator named Roland in the record, grunted as he shifted the condemned's weight. Roland's boots scraped the board. "Hold him steady, Thomas." Thomas moved to the other side and pinned the condemned's shoulders. "Thomas," the narrator recorded later, "kept the back pinned while I measured the joint." Dialogue in the room was spare and procedural. The magistrate cited law. The dismemberer made technical requests. The condemned begged. The opening sequence served its purpose as hook and stage. The court's function now was dual: judgment and spectacle. The magistrate wanted precedent maintained. The dismemberer wanted a precise execution. The condemned wanted breath. The narrator wanted the record. They moved through ritual. The magistrate unfolded the parchment and read names aloud. "Richard of Locksley," he said, pronouncing the condemned's name as if it were a ledger line. The clerk pronounced the offense. The dismemberer measured the condemned's knee with a brass caliper. He marked a thin line with charcoal. He spoke to no one in particular. "Joint here. 2 inches behind the patella." The dismemberer then reached for a long wedge and tested its edge against the wooden bench. He tapped it and listened for the exact tone. Fear became action. The condemned's chest rose fast. He attempted to twist his head to look toward the magistrate. He kept his voice small. "I did not," he said. The magistrate: "Silence." The law speaks for itself. The dismemberer positioned leather straps over the condemned's thigh and tightened buckles until the man's leg lay immobile. The dismemberer then checked the axe head for balance and set a folded cloth beneath the limb to collect runoff. Each movement decreased options. Each strap argued finality. 2 emotion shifts had already appeared. From fear to resigned compliance in the condemned. From procedural detachment to a flicker of unease in the dismemberer when he paused over the wedge. The narrator recorded ritual details as evidence. He noted the magistrate's ring, the folded parchment seal torn only at one corner, the clerk's trimmer when he placed the parchment on the table. He described the dismemberer's methodical gestures in clinical terms: measure, mark, bind, secure. The narrator wrote the exact language of the sentence and the statutory clause cited. This cataloguing was not decoration. It established what the officials would later defend and what the condemned could later contest. A mid-chapter revelation came while the dismemberer prepared a concealed modification. He unrolled a small, lacquered tube and showed it to the magistrate beneath the candle glow. "It will slow the bleed and prolong the display. The dismemberer, you want spectacle." "Sir," the magistrate replied with a short laugh. The dismemberer's fingers tightened. "Spectacle keeps precedent," the magistrate added. Their exchange was 3 short lines that shifted the scene. The purpose of the ritual was changing from law to intimidation. The dismemberer paused after the exchange, pressing his thumb against a burn scar on his forearm as if to steady his hand. Hearing the word spectacle, the condemned scraped the heel of his palm against the rope and spat. "You make sport of it," he said, voice thin. The magistrate did not flinch. "Richard, the magistrate, you were chosen, for example." The condemned's breath came in ragged pulls. That resistance, attempted speech, forced a change in the dismemberer's method. He adjusted the angle of the wedge and muttered numbers. The change was small but decisive. The cut would be slower and more public. Emotion shifted again in the room, from resigned acceptance to a new layer of dread in the condemned, and a hidden pride in the magistrate. When the procedure began, actions came fast and exact. The dismemberer drew the axe into a raised grip. He spoke a ritual line under his breath and struck once at a marked tendon. The cut opened with a wet sound. The condemned lunged under the straps and rolled his head. Guards gripped his arms and pressed him back. "Roland," the dismemberer ordered. "Press here." Roland pressed at the bound muscle. The narrator listed each sound. The axe, the intake of breath, the dull thump of the wedge. He recorded the time between strike and sever, 13 seconds in the written margin. Dialogue paced the action, the cut held, the dismemberer, voice low. "Hold him still." Thomas answered. "Thomas," Roland repeated. "He fights still." The condemned hissed. "I was not of Locksley," and then screamed. The magistrate kept his eyes on the parchment and on the crowd. He spoke to the clerk once. "Note the delay." Note the response. The clerk scratched words onto parchment with hand that trembled less now than before. The climax of the chapter arrived exactly at the beat-marked climax. The severing, the dismemberer raised the axe and struck. The execution followed a controlled choreography. 3 precise strikes, a wedge driven, an observation by the dismemberer, a notation by the clerk. The condemned grabbed at air with his remaining hand. He tried to bite down and stilled his jaw to push against the nausea. The dismemberer worked as if he were completing a technical task rather than an act of violence. He kept measuring between blows, checking the angle. The magistrate folded his fingers and watched the limb finally separate. The room filled with raw sound, the snapping of muscle, the clatter of tools, the condemned's words broken into short gasps. After the sever, procedures resumed like a machine. The dismemberer wrapped the stump in linen and tied knots in a practiced order. He then took a red, stained cloth and pressed until the drips slowed. The magistrate rose and pronounced the punishment fulfilled. He turned to the attendants and said, "Prepare the display." Outside the bench window a torchlit courtyard waited. The dismemberer carried the severed limb with both hands and wrapped it in the same solemnity he used when lifting any instrument. The narrator recorded the weight of the limb in the dismemberer's arms and the slight wobble in his step as if an old habit had misaligned. An attendant named Miriam closed the cloth and found a hidden token inside a glove that had been bound to the severed limb. Miriam allowed, "There is something here." She held up a small, folded crest, metal dulled by handling. The magistrate looked for a moment, then said, "Bring it to me." Miriam walked forward with the token between thumb and forefinger. The discovery changed the court's narrative. The magistrate studied the crest and then ordered the guards to increase the guard on the condemned. He barked, "No one leaves, no one speaks of this beyond the bench." The dismemberer watched the token and swallowed. His breath left in a thin line. The token suggested a link to a rival noble, evidence of association with Locksley, or with a patron unknown to the court, cut into the magistrate's certainty. The narrator noted the change. The magistrate's tone hardened. The clerks exchanged glances. A deliberate editing of record began even before the token was lifted for inspection. The magistrate spent seconds that lengthened like small instruments adjusting the final phrasing of the official minute. He substituted the word criminal for the name of an affiliation. He ordered the clerk to write that the limb had been displayed because of public safety rather than as spectacle. This rewriting was a soft violence. It reshaped events to fit power. Outside, the courtyard filled with whispers. Servants pointed at the pole where the limb would soon hang. The crowd's noise was a distant background the narrator measured in tone rather than content. He documented the magistrate's commands and the dismemberer's technical notes and the attendant's movements. He did not offer moral verdict. He recorded choices. Miriam's token became physical proof that someone had sought to conceal a connection. The magistrate's face reddened when the crest was clean enough to see. He swallowed and told the clerk to seal the token in a fresh parchment. The narrator followed traces. He watched the dismemberer write in a small ledger with cramped script, noting the tool modifications and the time between strikes. He watched the dismemberer pause when he wrote the purpose of the tube. Spectacle control. The dismemberer tapped the page twice with a finger stained by iron. That gesture showed more than a ledger line could. A private awareness of something wrong. When the dismemberer muttered to himself, the narrator recorded that phrase verbatim and dated it. A surprise unfolded. A guard whispered to the dismemberer that a messenger had been seen earlier in the day at the rival house. The dismemberer looked up, then down at the ledger. Name? He asked. The guard said a name the narrator transcribed. Sir Baldwin. The dismemberer wrote the name. The token now implied not only association, but coordination. The magistrate's hand closed over the parchment like a seal. The final paragraphs slowed procedure into consequence. The magistrate ordered the limb fastened to a pole. Miriam placed the wrapped limb into a crate and closed it. The condemned's remaining hand reached for the rosary at his neck and found only thread. I have a son, the magistrate. Nothing. He nodded at the attendants. The crowd outside chewed on rumor. The narrator closed the record for the night, noting the token, the name Sir Baldwin, the dismemberer's modification, and the magistrate's rewritten minutes. The chapter resolves its immediate conflict. The law was executed, the limb displayed, and the token found. The narrator left readers with a consequential action. The token sealed in parchment and set in the magistrate's private chest. Miriam protested to the clerk. This belongs in the open record. The clerk replied, the magistrate says otherwise, that short exchange counted as a decision. Officials would bury the clear hint of higher involvement. The final line of the chapter is concrete and situational. The magistrate closed his desk, turned the key, and set the sealed token into the dark of a drawer. The dismemberer emptied his gauntlets into a basin and tapped the handle twice before leaving. The condemned was carried out to the pole. The narrator closed his notebook and wrote one final entry. The night's ritual had been recorded, but the truth of who ordered spectacle remained hidden under seal. He followed the closed drawer with his pen. Bench and blade, the procedure. The dismemberer found the sealed directive folded thin beneath his rasp and read the seal by the match he struck, hands steady as if steadying a patient. Suspicion tightened the skin around his knuckles. He tapped the seal with a gloved finger and fanned the parchment like a man checking a blade. The paper smelled of smoke and court oil. The initials were the crown's. He did not expect an amendment. He did not expect spectacle. He set the directive on the bench and let the assistant, thin-shouldered Thomas, light the candles. The room was the executioner's workshop. Peg racks of tools, blocks scarred with old cuts, a shallow basin of dark water. The dismemberer ran a cloth along the axe edge and watched the flame quiver on the paper, as if testing the margin of law itself. Suspicion moved him inward. Inspect, verify, prepare. He did not speak a theory. He worked. Guards arrived before dawn with a shuffling of boots. They dragged the condemned across the threshold and left him on the work table, wrists raw where the rope had cut. The dismemberer looked at the marks, then at the directive again. He murmured to Thomas, "Test the straps. Match them to the new specifications." Thomas obeyed. He tightened a leather strap, then loosened it, then ran his fingers across the stitching. The condemned breathed shallow and counted breaths on his knuckles. He nothing at first. He watched the dismemberer with a tilt of his chin that was no longer defiance but a calculation. To anchor himself by watching the tools that would remove him. The magistrate entered at high noon, robe dragging, parchment sealed in hand. He climbed the dais and placed his seal face down on the bench as though that act alone altered gravity. He inspected the instruments with a slow, official gaze, lips a taut line. The Crown demands a public record. The magistrate make it instructive. Make it formal. The dismemberer opened the directive and read the amendment aloud once, twice, as if the words might rearrange into mercy. The new lines demanded ritualized humiliation in addition to limb removal. Banners, shouts announced by a town crier, and an extra instrument to split the bone for spectacle. The dismemberer felt the first shift. Suspicion moved to anger, sharp and immediate. He put his hand on the axe handle, the dismemberer, the magistrate, naming him as if the job and the man were interchangeable. "You will follow the amendment. Precedent matters. The Crown must be seen." His voice carried through the courtroom and settled on the condemned's shoulders. The condemned tried to steady his breath. "Magistrate," he said hoarsely, "this order was never given in writing until now. Why add shame to law?" The magistrate's eyes flicked toward the dais. "Because the Crown commands it. Because spectacle deters." That exchange opened a second emotional shift in the dismemberer. Anger hardened into a cold, procedural resolve. He had long performed dismemberments to law, not to pageantry. He saw himself as a technician of the body's mechanics, not a performer of cruelty. He replied without flourish, "I execute limbs in service of law, magistrate. I will not add parts that do not concern the severing itself." The magistrate's jaw tightened. He tapped the sealed parchment twice and named the dismemberer's reputation, which in that room meant livelihood and standing. "You will obey or you will lose your position." The magistrate, "Do you understand the stakes?" The dismemberer did. He also saw the condemned's rope marks and the thinness of the man's coat. He remembered the last sentence of his craft. Precision under order. He could perform the added instrument, calibrate the bone, splitter to produce the desired sound, and still carry out the law. Or he could refuse and risk everything. His hands did not shake as he set the axe in the block. "I understand," he said. Guards bound the condemned onto the bench. They crossed his wrists with a new strap specified by the amendment. The dismemberer tested the tension with his thumb. He drew a soft line along the flesh where the strap bit. The condemned hissed and tried to straighten his fingers. "Thomas," the dismemberer quietly, "pass me the wedge clamp." Thomas moved, hands fumbling. The dismemberer noticed how young Thomas' fingers lingered on the leather gauntlets. The dismemberer remembered being younger and slow, learning to steady a hand before a crowd. He set the wedge clamp and adjusted the blade angle with measured pressure. He whispered to himself as if rehearsing an incantation, but the whisper was a calculation. Bone density, likely break point, clean separation. The magistrate circled the bench, lips pursed. He inspected the arrangement as if it were a tapestry. Then the condemned shifted his weight, and a brown fold of cloth slipped free, a gloved hand revealing a creased stamp sewn into the lining. The token fell on the bench and tagged the magistrate's foot, scraping the gold trim of his robe. Silence snapped. The room inhaled through sword hilts and stitched robes. The dismemberer picked the token up with gloved fingers and unfolded the crease. The seal was familiar, the magistrate's household crest. The dismemberer felt the air change in a practical way, calculations and lines rearranged. The object rewired the courtroom logic. What had been a public reprimand became personal. The condemned's voice rose, Threading accusation into the open room, "Magistrate, you sent him orders. You wrote my name on that list. You called for this." His words landed like thrown stones. The magistrate's face flushed. Silence. He barked, then steadied. "That token proves nothing." "Put it away." The dismemberer held the token between forefinger and thumb and felt its ridged edges. He weighed options with the same thoroughness he used on steel. Follow the sealed amendment and produce the spectacle, or refuse and fracture the chain that linked him to the crown. Doubt flared. He had been the instrument of precedent for years. The dismemberer had never refused a crown order. In that hesitation, the third emotional shift arrived. The suspicion that first moved him became doubt, then refusal, then a narrowed clarity. The dismemberer, the magistrate, voice slower. "The crown requires the instrument beyond what you claim is necessary. You can add humiliation to the procedure. You can calibrate the bone splitter to create sound and terror. Or you can obey me now." The dismemberer set the token on the bench and looked at the condemned. The man watched him with a small, tired hope pinned beneath exhaustion. The dismemberer felt the room press on him. Robes, wooden benches, the magistrate's stare, but his decision had to be made on mechanics and outcome, not on the weight of a gaze. He closed his eyes for a single measured breath, and then opened them. "I will not add the extra instrument," he announced. "I will perform the severing cleanly, to law. The crown can hang banners and cry aloud, but I will not make the body theater." His voice was low, flat, and exact. The magistrate's mouth tightened. "You defy the crown's amendment?" he asked. "I refuse the added humiliation. I will not break a man's bones for sound." Silence, then a swarm of rapid exchanges. The magistrate snapped, "You will obey, you will obey," while the dismemberer answered, "I follow the law, I follow the craft." Then the condemned shouted, "Magistrate, you sent for this and now you deny it." The room filled with short, clipped sentences, three men trading authority, craft, and accusation in quick succession. The magistrate leaned in and named consequences. "You understand dismissal. You understand ruin. Submit now." The dismemberer flicked a gauntleted finger at the stacked instruments. "I understand consequences. I understand blunt force trauma and clean cuts. I also understand that my work must not become theater." A guard stepped forward, boots scuffing. He whispered a reminder to the magistrate about precedent and crowd reaction. The magistrate pressed his signet into his palm and hesitated, then straightened. He called for the execution to proceed as amended, his voice carrying the weight of law, even if his eyes stayed on the token. "Proceed," he ordered. The dismemberer did proceed, but he altered the execution's rhythm. He measured the axe's arc where the crowd expected flourish and slowed it instead into a controlled descent. He struck the bone with a single, practiced blow, and then reached for saw and ligament hook with the same measured sequence he had used for years. He avoided the bone, splitter that would have torn sound and shame from the act. He focused on the body's mechanical response. Tendon tension, arterial retraction, the small anatomical betrayals that revealed how a limb must be parted to minimize pain and chaos. The crowd murmured, unsettled. The magistrate's face hardened. The condemned let out a raw, breathy sound that could have been both relief and a scream. The dismemberer worked quickly, hands moving like a craftsman honoring a tool rather than a man. He checked clamps, adjusted pressure, and spoke no more than 1 or 2 words to Thomas at a time. When the final cut was made, and the limb removed cleanly into the basin, the dismemberer wrapped the stump with a strip of linen and tied a small notification tag. He set the tag on the table and exhaled once. The magistrate rose, robes whispering, and addressed the room with the ceremonial language demanded by his office, but the cadence of his sentences was clipped, brittle. He walked off the days without the robust applause he had expected. Outside the courtroom, a clerk filed a note that the amendment had been partially complied with and partially resisted. Word would spread. The dismemberer had refused spectacle. The magistrate had compromised his image but not his authority. The dismemberer felt the weight of that practical fallout. His status might endure. His pockets might hold the token now, folded and secreted into a seam of his apron. He pocketed it with the same careful motion he used to stow a file. That night the dismemberer returned to his workshop. He sat at the bench and unpacked his tools as if preparing for another procedure. Thomas stood by the door, face lit by candle, waiting for instruction or rebuke. The dismemberer slid the token across the bench toward Thomas and said simply, "Keep this. If anyone asks, you say you found it on the floor." Thomas nodded, fingers clenched. The dismemberer inked a small note in the margin of his ledger. No bone, splitter. No extra humiliation. Magistrate displeased, he dated it in neat numerals. He recorded the mechanical sequence he had used and the angles that had yielded the cleanest cut. He wrote nothing of emotion, only facts, measurements, and outcomes. In his ledger the world remained a set of tolerances to be respected or violated. Before he put out the candles, there was a knock at the workshop door. It was a soft, deliberate knock, 3 beats, and when the dismemberer opened the door a guard stood with a sealed packet from the dais. The dismemberer took it with his gauntleted hand and broke the seal. Inside was a single line, an order to appear before the magistrate at dawn to answer for deviation. The court would not forget. The dismemberer looked past the guard to Thomas and then to the ledger. He closed the book and slid it into the drawer. Outside, the city breathed damp and cold. The dismemberer's shoulders sagged in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. It was a practical adjustment to a new variable. He had made a technical choice that reshaped political theater. He had allowed the law to stand without adding a performance. He had also placed himself within a narrower band of safety. When dawn came, the dismemberer would stand again at the magistrate's dais and answer for the choice he had made. The token in Thomas's pocket would become a held fact, and the clerk's note would spread through corridors of power. The dismemberer closed the workshop door on the candlelight and the smell of oil, and walked into the thin grey that prefaced morning. The bench had been emptied, the instruments put away, but the ledger and the token remained. Small, concrete proofs that a single measured refusal could alter the public script. The chapter ends with the dismemberer stepping out into the street, the packet heavy in his hand and the knowledge that the magistrate's displeasure would require a reply. An arrival at the dais at dawn and a decision that would be recorded in ink. The secret writ and altered ritual. The courier slammed the shuttered door open and shoved a folded seal into the dismemberer's palm before the man could step back. Betrayal tightened the dismemberer's jaw as he tore the wax with a dull knife. He read 3 lines, then read them again. "This is altered," he said, voice low. "This makes it a spectacle." The courier had already gone. The corridor swallowed his retreating boots. The room smelled of wet stone and candle wax and the faint copper of old blood from the bench 2 doors down. The dismemberer had been trained to treat limbs like joined timber and rope, to judge tension, grain, and the precise angle of a blade. He kept his hands clean for craft. He had learned to call his craft neutral. Now a sealed amendment turned his craft into theater. He set the parchment on the stone table and placed his gloved hand flat over the seal as if it could slow the clock. He did not speak the word treason. He did not have to. The seal carried the crown's authority and the magistrate's signet. A week earlier the magistrate had read the royal writ on the raised bench while candles guttered along the plinth. Guards shoved the condemned across the polished boards and the condemned coughed, palms raw where the rope had bitten. The magistrate lifted the parchment and declared law. The dismemberer remembered the cued faces in the hall, the way the crowd leaned forward to watch a professional cut. The memory sharpened his reluctance into a policy question. Would he perform precise execution or conform to a staged degradation? His first emotion, suspicion, hardened into a decision point. He turned the parchment under the low oil lamp. The amendment required an altered sequence. Public delay, visible signs of prolonged hurt, tied movements, so that the cut would be seen to fail twice before succeeding. They want a spectacle, he said aloud. The sound of his own voice made him flinch. He folded the paper and pocketed it beneath the inner layer of his smock where his tools would rest. He moved with the routine motions of a craftsman preparing instruments, but his hands shook when they touched fresh straps. A step in the corridor announced the magistrate. The dismemberer bowed once because habit demanded it. The magistrate watched him like a man appraising a clock. You read it. The magistrate. He placed his signet on the table and pushed it toward the dismemberer the way a man might push a test across a bench. You will follow the amendment. No deviation. Fail me and you lose your tools and your standing. His mouth flattened. His ring caught the light and flashed. The dismemberer swallowed. You do not understand my position, magistrate. The dismemberer. He kept his voice steady. I have standards. A clean cut is part of the process. To prolong is to cause needless suffering. The magistrate's face did not change. He lifted a finger and the lead guard stepped closer. Standards do not matter to the crown today. The magistrate. He pressed the signet into the dismemberer's palm, and the weight of that brass matched the weight of the order. Follow the writ. Mark him as traitor. Make the people remember. Later, in the narrow corridor by the magistrate's antechamber, a brief exchange sealed more than leather. The dismemberer met the lead guard's eyes. You heard the order. The guard asked, do it cleanly if you can. The guard added with a look that was not quite sympathy. Do it cleanly and no one else has to see what we are told to show. The dismemberer nodded. They both knew what clean had meant for years. A precise tool, a single strike, a quick bandage, a quiet burial. The magistrate wanted different things now. The dismemberer felt his profession change under his fingers. Guards brought the condemned into the low preparation room. The man looked smaller here, shoulders hunched, wrists rubbed raw. He had the rosary in his hand and his lips moved without sound. The condemned, the lead guard said as he pushed the man forward. The dismemberer inspected the modified restraint the way a mason checks a chisel. The ropes had new loops and a catch that would hold the limb at a strange angle. He ran gloved fingers along unfamiliar fittings and felt them cool. The condemned's eyes found his. Forgive me. The condemned, voice hoarse. Please, dismemberer, make it quick. He the name as if it were a plebeian thing. The dismemberer looked away. He tightened a strap and tapped a hammer twice, the small ritual he used to center himself. I will do what I must. The dismemberer replied. He did not promise speed. He held the rosary between his thumb and forefinger for a moment, and then handed it back. Hold it. Grip it hard, he said. A guard slipped a folded note into the dismemberer's palm while adjusting straps. The dismemberer unfolded it with a finger that did not tremble. The note was terse. It outlined a mandated prolonged technique for ceremonial marking. The first strike to be deliberately imprecise. A visible pause while the crowd watched the condemned writhe. A second, slower incision to finish the sentence. The guard's eyes met his. The magistrate made this clear. The guard said, they will watch every motion. Failure means disgrace for you. The dismemberer folded the paper and slid it inside his apron. Suspicion shifted to fear. The dismemberer felt the cold creep into his chest like water. He tried to count the tools on his belt. He ran a thumb along the leather gauntlet, feeling the colaces. He himself, the technique could be controlled. He rehearsed angles in his head. He checked the restraint again and found a hairline flaw where a strap chafed. He tightened a knot to secure the limb. The condemned watched the motions and angled his head as if import could be read in the dismemberer's hands. Outside the hall, the magistrate arranged his papers with a small ceremonial motion. He folded the new amendment and tucked it into his robe. We will drive fear, he said to a nearby scribe. We will show the cost of defiance. His voice had the calm of one who has practiced a speech. The scribe nodded and rolled a parchment. Yes, magistrate. The scribe answered, though his fingers were ink. stained and his jaw tight. The magistrate glanced toward the hall, and then at the window where a thin line of townspeople had gathered to peer through barred openings. They led the condemned out. The hall smelled of wax and cold stone. People leaned forward with the anticipation of watchers at a play. The magistrate took his seat on the raised bench. The dismemberer strapped leather against flesh and felt the linen shift under the raw rope marks. He looked at the condemned for one last time. The condemned tried to speak. "Magistrate," he said, "I did not." The magistrate cut him off with a single word: silence. The crowd made small sounds of assent. The dismemberer placed the instrument against the marked joint. He struck. The first blow faltered. It was not a clean separation. The blade skidded, glanced, and missed a critical groove. The condemned's throat made a noise that had no name. The crowd inhaled. The magistrate leaned forward and looked satisfied, the way a man who had designed the show might look. The dismemberer froze for half a breath. He had meant it to be clean. He had not meant to miss. His hands shook. He could feel his calloused palms betray him, finish him. The magistrate, voice calm and absolute. The dismemberer took a second strike. He adjusted his grip and set a new angle. He would control the pain, measure the arc, honor the craft. The second strike cut deeper. It lingered, it tore, it extended the condemned's agony beyond the precise event and into a slow collapse of noise and muscle. The dismemberer saw the light leave the condemned's pupils and felt a motion inside his chest that was not technical. It felt like a hollowing. He worked the tools with hands that moved on habit, not will. The hall reacted. A woman screamed and someone vomited. The magistrate rose and issued curt orders to the guards. Take him away. Bury him under the Crown's cess charge. No witness stays beyond the threshold. Seal the bench logs, the lead guard barked, and the condemned's body was hauled across the stone with rough hands. The dismemberer stood behind his tools, trembling. He pressed a cloth to the blade and wiped. He catalogued the nick and the smear. He counted the seconds that had stretched into minutes. In the side corridor, a guard folded a ledger and thrust it toward the dismemberer. "The magistrate's envoy will visit the tool room in an hour," the guard said. "They will collect your note and record your cooperation." The dismemberer felt the ledger's weight like a verdict. He walked to the tool room and began to clean systematically. He scrubbed the leather and iron until the room smelled of cleaner and old metal rather than blood. He stacked the tools in their places. His motions were mechanical. The narrator, who had been noting the day's events, watched him do this through a half-open door and kept his voice low. "You did what you were told." The narrator. His tone was even and dry. He noted the dismemberer's hands, the double tap of the hammer, the small ritual the technician used to steady himself. "You followed an order." The amendment demanded public marking. The dismemberer did not answer at first. He held a file to a blade and breathed through his nose. He felt guilt like a weight placed on his shoulder, not an abstract label but a physical pressure that made his knees ache. The magistrate's envoy arrived with a ledger wrapped in plain cloth. The envoy's boots were clean and his face was expressionless. He laid the ledger on the tool room table and opened it. "Sign here to confirm procedure," the envoy said. His pen scratched. The dismemberer dipped the end of his thumb in ink and pressed it to the page beside the scripted line. His thumb left a smudge. The envoy frowned and wiped it away with a practiced motion. "Silence is required," the envoy said. He slid a folded packet across the table. "This will keep you in your place. The magistrate keeps his promises." The packet contained a small coin and a notation. "Closure in exchange for silence." The dismemberer slid the coin into a pocket but did not hide the ledger. He opened it and read the line that documented the modified technique, as if it were a mechanical drawing. The narrator wrote down the notation under candlelight and circled the passage that described the two-stage incision. He spoke as he wrote. "There is a pattern here, a deliberate extension of injury to brand a man as traitor in the eyes of others. The magistrate uses ritual to manufacture terror. The dismemberer watched the narrator's hands, the way the pen moved with a steady, merciless rhythm. An unexpected reveal shifted the chapter again. Inside the ledger, the narrator found a note in a different hand. A smaller script added after the amendment was filed. It read, "Record also the crowd's response. Adjust show for maximum recall." The dismemberer touched the ink with a finger. The added instruction turned punishment into calculation. It made the magistrate's taste for spectacle, not only political but performative. The dismemberer realized he had been made both instrument and prop. Anger rose next, quick and hot. The dismemberer slammed a wooden block to the bench, and the sound echoed, "Magistrate." He said aloud into the empty room, "He wanted me to make noise of suffering. He wanted me to give them a story." The narrator did not flinch. The magistrate wanted the crowd to remember. The narrator, he wants deterrence that shows, not justice that ends. The dismemberer paced. He rubbed the inside of his wrist, where a burn scar marked years of labor. He thought of the measurements he had learned, the angles that made a clean end. He thought also of the condemned's last expression. A flicker of defiance, a half-formed word. The dismemberer had not been able to catch it. He felt guilt, then a shift into something like resolve. He decided to record every modification he could recall. He opened a worn leather journal and began to write the steps, the straps, the imprecise angle, the timing between strikes, the exact words from the magistrate. He wrote in short lines. The narrator read over his shoulder once and nodded. "You will keep this safe." The narrator, "I will copy what you cannot risk carrying. We will place it with the others in the archives." The dismemberer folded the journal and pressed the pages flat. The magistrate's envoy watched them exchange paper and coin like a man who handled bribes daily. "Remember," the envoy said, "we value order. We close what must be closed." He left the ledger on the table and drew the cloth over it as if it were a shroud. Outside, the crowd murmured and left in small groups. A child had cried. A woman had spat when she saw the blood. The magistrate walked back to his chambers. He ran a finger along his signet ring and considered the bench, the laws, and the spectacle he had orchestrated. He had preserved order. He himself, the sight of pain would stop others from stepping beyond his boundary. The dismemberer watched him go and felt the last emotion settle in. Shame. It sat in his chest like a cold stone, but also pressed him into motion. He would not speak of resistance tonight. He would catalogue the details. He would give the narrator an account that named the method, the tools, and the changes. He would mark the ledger with his thumb impression and keep a private note of the guard who had slipped him the folded paper with specific phrasing. The dismemberer wrapped the instrument in oilcloth and hid it in a false panel in the tool chest. He extinguished the lamp and let the room cool. The chapter closed with a deliberate, physical act. The narrator set the written amendment into the archives folder and locked the chest with a small brass key. He placed the key into his pocket and felt its weight. Steps approached the corridor outside, measured and assured. Footsteps stopped at the door. The dismemberer pressed his palm to the wooden surface and listened. A knock came, 3 measured taps. The key slid in the narrator's fingers as if it were a warning. The door opened. A silence fell that was not for mourning. It was for the ledger, for the tools, for the memory they now shared. The dismemberer looked at the magistrate's envoy as the man stepped across the threshold. The envoy's face was blank. He carried a new seal in his hand. The magistrate expected a record. The dismemberer expected a price. The narrator closed the ledger and placed the documented amendment with the other sealed orders. Footsteps moved past the hall and down the stairwell. The sound receded into the stone. The room smelled of wax and ink and the thin copper left on the blade. The dismemberer let his shoulders drop. He did not speak. He folded his hands over the wrapped instrument and waited as the door shut with a small, final click. Altered spectacle. The magistrate snapped the folded parchment open on the dais, and read the altered sentence aloud, his voice slotted and sure, and the courtyard answered with a brittle intake of breath. Betrayal pressed at the dismemberer's throat as he watched the crowd gather. The courier had arrived, the sealed clause had been added, and the dismemberer understood that what he would do now was no longer a private execution, but a lesson published before the people. The condemned strained against the guards, palms raw from rope, and the magistrate's eyes did not move from the script. The core problem was visible in those first lines. The Crown had written the procedure to prolong pain for spectacle, and someone had shifted responsibility from law to theatre. The narrator recorded everything with the same measured cadence he used in court transcripts, listing facts, names, and times as if they were instruments laid on a table. He noted the dusk light striking the magistrate's signet and the way the courier's hands trembled when he offered the second writ. He noted, clinically, the dismemberer's breath caught, the dismemberer's fingers tightening on the belt of tools. The narrator's emotion root, betrayal, sat in his description as a motive. Betrayal of ritual, betrayal of precedent, betrayal of the executioner's oath. That betrayal would dictate choices for the men on the stone days. The magistrate, the dismemberer, and the condemned. Guards hauled the condemned onto the dais. The same motion that had begun an earlier ritual on a polished bench where candles had guttered and the magistrate had read a sealed parchment. The narrator referred back to the earlier bench, to the cough that had rattled the condemned's chest then, and to the magistrate's phrase, "by order of the Crown," recorded in the margins of the first writ. The crowd on the courtyard stones was larger now. Merchants had closed shutters to peek. Servants stood on crates, a single torch blid orange near the archway. The magistrate raised the new seal and read the added clause that demanded the prolongation of the procedure for deterrence and instruction, and said the Crown's name with a weight that made the courtyard lean into it. Magistrate. The dismemberer, voice low and controlled, "This clause changes the method." He put the tools down carefully as a man would set scalpels on clean linen. His palms showed calluses along the edges. "The dismemberer is not a showman," the dismemberer added, sliding the leather gauntlets up his forearms. The magistrate's reply was a measured lift of a chin and a small smile that held no warmth. "The magistrate will have precedent. The magistrate will have the crowd know why law costs flesh." The dismemberer tapped the belt of tools twice with his knuckle, a ritual motion that steadied him. He looked at the condemned and found a hazel eye that flared with fresh defiance. The condemned jerked once, lunging at the magistrate's hem, and the guards had to pull him back. "Condemned!" A guard barked, "Enough!" The struggle lasted less than a breath. It changed the crowd from a murmuring curiosity into a gathering of teeth. The dismemberer walked to the raised stone dais and began the inspection demanded by the magistrate. He lifted instruments one by one, checking edges, grips, and balance. He smelled oil and iron. He felt the weight of each axe head and the grit on the shaft where a previous hand had rested. The magistrate watched him with a ledger of faces in the crowd, as if the ledger could be read aloud and judged. "You will do as the writ states." The magistrate to the dismemberer, "You will stretch the process. You will let them learn by watching." The dismemberer's hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. He counted tools with a mechanical precision. Knife, wedge, block, restraint, hammer, each item he named silently in exact order. Behind the bench, in a shadowed alcove, the magistrate held out the promise of reward and reprimand in the same breath. "Serve the Crown well, and the Crown remembers," he said, fingers folding into the folds of his robe. "Serve badly, and the role is given to another." The dismemberer answered with no smile. He folded his shoulders once and closed his mouth. The dismemberer does not ask for praise. The dismemberer asks only to be allowed the method he knows. The magistrate touched the jeweled signet and let the touch sit like a claim. He recited precedent, 2 earlier sentences where spectacle had been avoided, and then overrode them with a citation older than both. The dismemberer felt a slow shift inside him. Doubt moved to resignation. He kept counting. An unexpected click sounded near the day's rim. The courier had returned, and his gait had the urgency of a man who had been shoved into a small, dangerous trust. The courier produced a second sealed writ and shoved it into the dismemberer's palm. The wax broke with a dull puncture, and the dismemberer read the new clause aloud to himself, lips moving in the quiet. The clause ordered the prolongation of the ritual into stages, to pause to display, and to demand recognition from the crowd. This is altered, the dismemberer, and the word split the quiet. He looked up at the magistrate. The magistrate insists. The magistrate has the crown's hand. He rolled the paper between two fingers, showing the seal. The dismemberer felt betrayal move into anger, not at law, but at the relocation of moral burden. This was a twist that shifted blame onto the hand that would hold the blade, a hidden clause that made the execution a didactic pageant. The narrator wrote the moment down, short, precise sentences, and recorded the dismemberer's pause before he put the paper aside and returned to the instruments. The condemned spat at the magistrate's boots, and the sound was a small explosion in the hush. Condemned, a guard said, voice hard, hold your tongue. The condemned answered, ragged and loud, magistrate, do you think this ends anyone's thought but with blood? He tried to pull free and was restrained. The crowd leaned forward on elbows and knees. The torchlight threw faces into carved angles, and the sound of ropes scraped like cloth on stone. The magistrate did not flinch. The magistrate wants order. The magistrate wants obedience. His baritone cut the exchange into pieces of fact. The dismemberer worked with methodical motions as he prepared the bench. He scrubbed the block with a cloth, set the wedge at a measured angle, and arranged irons for binding. Each movement was a small affirmation of craft. He tightened straps against a limb and turned the screw until the wood bit into rope marks already on the condemned's wrists. The condemned's breath came shorter. Dismemberer, he said once, voice thin. Do you remember the bench where candles guttered? The dismemberer's hands did not stop. I remember, the dismemberer. The dialogue was simple and short. It revealed two things. The dismemberer had memory of earlier ritual, and the condemned clung to those details as a way to be seen. In the middle of preparations, a guard stumbled backward and shouted. A child at the crowd's rim had fainted from the sight of the irons. The crowd surged briefly, and the magistrate slapped a hand on the ledger to restore order. This small external event shifted the tempo, a mini cliffhanger. Would the crowd erupt or be controlled? The magistrate used the moment. He leaned forward, fixed the gaze of the crowd, and read a passage aloud that framed the execution as instruction. The dismemberer held the wedge, feeling the eyes of hundreds. He straightened, inhaled, and tightened the strap around the condemned's ankle. The negotiation between public will and private mechanics narrowed to the space between strap and skin. When two men argued in the alcove about timing, there were 6 short, staccato exchanges. We delay, the magistrate. We do not delay, the dismemberer countered. Magistrate. The magistrate, your duty is to the crown. Dismemberer. The dismemberer replied, my duty is to the method. The magistrate will decide. The magistrate. Then do it as the writ commands. The dismemberer. The rapid back and forth kept sentences short, voices clipped. It revealed a tug of war where neither man would publicly yield. Their names peppered the dialogue, so the listeners could follow who moved which way. The exchange ended with the dismemberer counting tools in silence. At the day's edge, the dismemberer performed the first cut of the procedure as specified by the new writ. A deliberate incision, then a pause, then another slow step. The crowd watched the cadence. The magistrate stepped forward between stages to speak, labeling each motion as a lesson. Let this teach them, the magistrate commanded. The dismemberer followed the sequence, but lengthened every pause by a heartbeat more than necessary. He gave the crowd time to see the hinge of the operation. to see hands press, to see leather straps catch. Each measured pause stretched the condemned's ability to breathe, and with each stretch the dismemberer felt his own stomach pinch. Betrayal had turned into a grudging compliance that tasted like ash. Halfway through the altered ritual, the dismemberer discovered a hidden detail. The added clause required that a token be given to the dismemberer at the end, a small iron badge denoting the crown's favor. The courier had already produced it. The courier's fingers had been clumsy, and the dismemberer had seen the seal on the token before the magistrate noted it. The token changed everything. It turned the execution into a performance with a medal. The dismemberer's emotion shifted from resignation to calculation. He began to act as if each motion on the bench could be measured and reversed. He speeded one motion to catch a shielded pause, and the crowd gasped. A woman near the archway buried her face in a cloth. The condemned tried to draw words from his throat. "Magistrate," he said hoarsely, "you will not teach them mercy." He spat again. The droplets struck the stone. The magistrate did not look away. The magistrate teaches supply and consequence. The magistrate will also teach stamina. The dismemberer placed the wedge and struck the hammer twice, the ritual tap he always took before the main action. His hands did not shake, but his knuckles whitened. The narrator recorded the 2 taps as deliberate, and noted the dismemberer's small cough between motions. The crowd leaned in. Someone held a child to their chest and pressed forward so the child could see. When the crucial moment arrived, the dismemberer's method stretched into public cruelty as ordered. The magistrate raised his hands, and the street voice softened into silence. The blade fell, and the dismemberer felt the physical shock of practice. Bone resistance, the dull echo in his forearm, the metallic scent. The narrator described the cut with clinical precision. Where the knife met tendon, where the wedge aligned, how the wood soaked. It was the chapter's climax, and it was exacting and loud in ways the magistrate wanted, and the dismemberer had feared. Immediately after the final stage, the crowd's reaction ruptured into a scattered chorus of sounds. A low animal howl from the market boys, someone vomiting behind the crates, hands smashing the air in an attempt to cover faces. The magistrate stepped forward and opened his mouth to reclaim order. His voice cut through the noise, demanding stillness. "The magistrate enforces the law," he said, and his phrase pulled the crowd back like reins. The dismemberer withdrew from the bench and thumbed the coin, sized iron token into his palm. In the quiet that followed, the dismemberer slipped the token into a pocket and pressed a fingertip along an old burn scar on his forearm. The narrator recorded the motion, the token taken, the scar touched because it mattered. The condemned's rosary lay on the stone where his hand had left it. Someone at the crowd's edge picked it up and then set it down again, unable to take it into the press. The dismemberer watched the rosary winter into the crack between 2 stones and felt the last of his agitation cool into a numbness. After the bench was cleared, the magistrate made note of law and consequence before the ledger, and the crowd began to thin in clusters, discussing what they had seen. The magistrate folded the new writ and tucked it into his robe like a merit badge. He met the dismemberer's eyes with a look that was flat and precise. "The magistrate will reward the dismemberer," he said. The magistrate will remember obedience." The dismemberer did not answer. He adjusted his gauntlets, lifted his head, and exhaled as if he were blowing out a candle that had been kept lit too long. Outside the day's gate, a courier argued with a guard about who had handed which writ to whom, and the narrator recorded names and motions because the argument exposed the chain of custody for the alteration. The dismemberer slid his hand into his pocket and felt the token's edge. He believed the token could be used or kept as evidence depending on what he decided to do next. That decision would be his alone. The crowd would disperse, and the magistrate would claim the evening as victory. The dismemberer's emotions shifted once more from numbness into a quiet, purposeful clarity. He rubbed the token between 2 fingers and found the tiny hammer mark that matched the seal. The chapter closed on concrete details. A rosary left on stone, a token in a pocket, the magistrate's ledger closed and sealed. The narrator wrote these items down because they would be called in future hearings, and because each object now carried legal weight. The dismemberer walked away from the dais with shoulders squared, though his face did not change. He had complied. He had kept order. He had protected his craft while the crown rewrote the lesson. Behind him, the magistrate straightened his robes, smoothed the finger marks from his ledger, and looked out over the stones to catalogue the night as precedent. As the dawn began to pale the sky, the condemned's rosary lay wet, with a smear of blood where the stone had caught it. A guard picked it up and placed it on a low ledge near the corridor, then left without a backward glance. The narrator ended the chapter by recording that small placement as a situational beat. The rosary on the ledge, the token hidden in a pocket, the magistrate's seal still warm on paper. The dismemberer paused at the corridor threshold, felt the weight in his pocket, and pushed his hand out of sight as he stepped into the cold corridor, his decision heavy but unannounced. The spectacle on the block. Guards shoved the condemned across the polished boards and lashed him to the block while rain spat at the courtyard. The dismemberer pried back a small brass plate nailed to the timber and rid the altered claws for the first time in daylight. Betrayal rose cold in the dismemberer's throat as he read the phrase that turned a lawful sentence into a public spectacle. The magistrate stood on the raised platform and stared down at the sheet without flinching. His hand tightened on a sealed stamp. The problem was not only what was to be done to one man. The problem was that the writ had been altered to serve a patron's vengeance, and every hand present would be asked to perform that vengeance in public. The dismemberer had not expected spectacle. He had expected the sealed directive he found 2 nights earlier beneath his rasp to match the routine of his work. Name, cause, measure, method. He had lifted that directive by candle and recognized the wax, then smelled the parchment and found the salt of wet ink. He tapped the seal with a gloved finger and told himself the clause would be ordinary. The courier who had slammed the shuttered door in Chapter 3 had brought a different paper. The dismemberer remembered the courier's haste, the way the man shoved the folded seal into his palm. That memory sat behind every measured movement he made this morning. The courtyard smelled of damp wool, wet straw, and the iron tang left on his gloves from the tool bench. The condemned's knees scraped the wood as guards tightened the cords. The crowd pressed the rope. Leather soles slapped, metal cups clinked, a child shout rose and snapped off. The dismemberer laid his tools on the bench and checked one hinge by touch, not by sight, feeling for a give that would determine how each instrument bit. He had always kept his craft precise. His work required no rumor and no improvisation. This writ required spectacle. A herald climbed the platform and rolled the parchment the magistrate handed him. The dismemberer watched the magistrate seal the document with a slow thumb, and the low click of the stamp echoed once through the courtyard. The herald cleared his throat and began to read. The dismemberer felt suspicion tighten along the skin of his knuckles and pivoted toward the magistrate afterward in a step that put him close enough for whisper. "Magistrate." The dismemberer voice low. "This clause is not ours." The magistrate did not smile. "This is the law today," he replied. "Read it out and be done. You altered it." "The dismemberer who signed beneath your hand." The magistrate's jaw moved. You know the court's needs. You know the crown's answer. "Speak plainly, dismemberer." The dismemberer's fingers curled around a hammer. He tapped the bench twice, a small private ritual he kept before every stroke. He had learned, from earlier directives and from the sealed parchment, how to hold the instrument so the task would finish cleanly. He had also learned that a single alteration in a tool could turn the craft into either mercy or cruelty. The herald's voice rose again, and the crowd heard the altered sentence. The condemned would be displayed, his limbs removed one by one upon order of a named patron, so that the city might witness the patron's vengeance. Murmurs moved like wind through the assembly. A noble laughed once, a metallic sound. A woman nearer the ropes let out a low keening. The condemned's face went pale, where the rain had run into the cut on his temple. The courier pushed through the rope line and produced a second sealed page in his hand. He laid it on the magistrate's table and forced the seal open with a fingernail. "This name's a patron." The courier said loud enough that the words reached the bench. "It is not justice. It is private order." His eyes darted to the dismemberer. "They meet to bring proof." The magistrate's expression tightened. He did not shout. He clipped, "This is a court matter." "Take your seat." The dismemberer stepped to the shadowed ledge beside the dais, where the magistrate stood, and put his palm flat on the cold stone. He leaned close enough that his breath left a wet arc on the magistrate's sleeve. "You will not make me the showman of a favor." The dismemberer. "Tell me whose hand is behind this writ." The magistrate answered, "You take orders. You know what happens to those who refuse orders." He pushed the stamp across the table with one finger. "You know what you used to be without your post. Remember that." They traded a line of threats that was not loud but very plain. The dismemberer, "You named blood for spectacle." The magistrate, "The blood keeps order." The exchange was quick. 4 sentences, and the crowd's attention tightened. That private confrontation shifted the dismemberer's next choice from mere complaint to calculation. Back at the bench, the dismemberer sat beside his tools and inspected each piece with a craftsman's eye. He lifted an axe blade and held it to the light to test the bevel. He ran a whetstone along an iron saw and listened to the rasper's tone. He weighed a strap and considered the pattern of rivets on a new cleat. Each small choice would steer the morning toward either a clean measure or a lingering spectacle. He made a decision. He took the shortest blade, the one meant for clean separation, and eased a narrow groove along its haft, where a leather tie usually sat. He replaced 3 rivets with a rivet that rattled slightly when struck. He worked slowly, as if fitting a patient before a procedure, and he worked in such a way that only he would feel the difference when the instrument met flesh and bone. He did not whine or call for pardon. He simply changed one mechanism. The dismemberer had learned his trade by touch. He had learned that small mechanical changes could alter a sentence. The condemned watched him from the block. The man's breathing was shallow and quick. He mouthed a single name under his breath, an invocation or a plea. The narrator could not know, and then his lips went rigid. The dismemberer caught the condemned sigh and laid a gloved hand on the man's wrist, where the rope rubbed red. It was a brief human gesture. The condemned answered with a nod so slight it might have been a twitch. "Dismemberer." The condemned whispered, voice hoarse, "Do it quick." The dismemberer did not reply. He tightened a strap on the bench and set the altered blade where his palm could find it blind. He slid a small scrap of cloth into his pocket, the same scrap he had used to wrap a rosary bead in a different season. He had no words for the condemned, he had choices. The ceremony resumed. The herald completed the reading of the writ, and the magistrate raised his hand for silence. The crowd leaned forward. Signals passed down the ropes. A child in a hooded coat pointed, and a noble-as gentleman stepped back. Rain plastered hair to faces and pooled in the hollows of carved stone. The dismemberer stood with his back to the crowd and his face to the condemned. He set his shoulders and began the procedure exactly as the altered writ demanded, save for the one mechanical modification he had made. The first motion was surgical. The dismemberer placed the strap, lined the blade, and set his shoulder. He struck the instrument in the accustomed cadence, the one that would have once sent the work to its necessary end. When the mechanism met the human joint, there was a resistance in the wood, a sound like a hard plank being split rather than soft flesh parting. The blade's altered rivet made the instrument twist on contact. The crowd inhaled as one. A sound came that the narrator recorded clinically. A brittle mechanical tear, followed by an animal cry that the crowd turned into a chorus. The magistrate's eyes widened. He had not expected the instrument to behave that way under a professional hand. The dismemberer had prepared the tool to force a fast rupture at a joint that would end the sentence with an immediate and visible result, but without the prolonged spectacle the patron intended. In that instant the spectacle became its own accusation. Nobles in the front rows recoiled. Men who had leaned forward to be seen shifted and muttered. A noblewoman shoved her sleeve into her mouth and began to sob. Soldiers tugged at ropes to widen the rings of viewers. The magistrate barked a command that could not anchor the crowd. He stepped down from the platform and thrust his voice out over the assembly. "Bring order!" The magistrate shouted, "Bring order and hold your tongues!" A faction in the crowd shouted back, "Justice!"
"Justice!"
Another segment cried. A group of young nobles called that the dismemberer had acted with skill and should be honored. A faint voice asked whether the patron's name should be struck from the writ. The courier who had produced the second sealed page leaned forward and pointed. "He names Earl Roth." The courier called. Earl Roth sought this spectacle for vendetta. The magistrate's face went red. He blinked and then began to cast blame outward. This was the dismemberer's method, he said. He chose to mar the execution. He failed the court. The dismemberer did not step back. He set the next tool into place and worked as he had practiced. But now the crowd's mood had shifted into chaos. Some who wanted spectacle called for continuation. Others called for investigation. A small knot of nobles moved to the magistrate's side and whispered. A single voice rose that said, "The magistrate sealed the writ." He signed. The accusation moved like a spark. A rapid exchange followed between the magistrate and one of the nobles who stepped forward. "Magistrate," the noble said, "why did you sign such a clause?" The magistrate answered, "You know the crown's need. You know nothing of order if you hide behind the crown." The noble shot back, "You will hold your tongue." The magistrate barked, "Will you hold your tongue?" The noble retorted, "Who owns this writ?" The back and forth lasted 6 lines and drew attention away from the block. The dismemberer used the pause to finish the altered procedure. The second action produced an audible, decisive sound that made even the nobles still at the ropes turn away. Where the instrument had met the joint, the condemned's body shuddered. The dismemberer wrapped a cloth and tied it tight, then stepped back and let the attendants carry the form away. There were no ornate proclamations as the body left, only the steady, bureaucratic motions of men who had paperwork to fill. In the scramble, the courier planted himself by the magistrate and pushed forward the second sealed paper so that all could see the name. A murmur rose that did not die down. Some in the assembly shouted that the dismemberer had turned the court into a spectacle of mercy. Others said he had sabotaged a lawful sentence. The magistrate tried to reassert control by naming an inquiry, but the inquiry could not move fast enough to seal the rumor that had opened in the square. The narrator recorded consequences with the same clinical steadiness with which he had recorded the procedure. Clerks were ordered to copy the day's events into the ledger. A young scribe took the parchment and wrote the magistrate's hand, then copied the courier's paper. The dismemberer was led aside by 2 officers whose faces showed both caution and calculation. The magistrate convened a cluster of nobles and pointed at the bench where the tools still lay. "Dismemberer," one officer said quietly as he took the man's arms. "You will answer for this in the council." The dismemberer nodded. He did not speak. He had expected that his action would be noticed, and that notice would demand a price. He had also expected it to break the particular cruelty the patrons sought. That had been his choice. Obedience to craft versus obedience to a writ corrupted by vendetta. He had chosen craft. The condemned's body was carried under a rough cloth to the cart at the courtyard's edge. A woman with a shawl reached out and touched the cloth as the cart passed, then snatched her hand back as if afraid of a stain. The public whooped and hissed in uneven waves. Some called for the magistrate to answer, others denounced the dismemberer. A small group of merchants muttered about how the spectacle would damage trade. A priest murmured a prayer into his cupped hands. Within an hour, the magistrate's staff had filed 3 testimonies, and the clerk had dated the entries. The courier's sealed paper was placed in the desk of a steward who did not wish to be named in public. The dismemberer was led into a small chamber off the square, where the light through the shutter made a rectangle on stone. 2 men sat with him. One was an officer with a sharp nose and narrow eyes, the other a nobleman whose dark coat bore a smudge of damp. The officer spoke in blunt sentences. "You altered the tool," he said. "You changed the instrument deliberately." The dismemberer met his eyes. "I changed the instrument so it would end quickly," he said. "I refused spectacle." The nobleman scoffed. "Refused spectacle. You altered the sentence effect in front of the city. That is not refusal, that is theater." The officer folded his hands. "We will take this to the council. If the magistrate chooses to press, you will face punishment." The dismemberer watched the officer's fingers drum once on the table. He had not expected gratitude. He had expected consequences. He had also expected that some would call him a hero and some a criminal. He then let the council decide. His voice was low and level. Outside the chamber, rumors had already outpaced ink. Guildsmen spoke of the writ by name. Children repeated the word spectacle like a game. The clerk copied the magistrate's report with a hand that trembled once. A noblewoman demanded an immediate audience with the steward. The steward refused and directed the matter to the chancellor, who would delay and then file the ledger under the day's events. Weeks later, the record would show 2 possibilities: the dismemberer detained pending inquiry, or the dismemberer quietly rewarded by an unnamed sponsor for acting with craft. The truth would depend on which parchment one read, and who owned the ink at the time. For that morning, the dismemberer was led out of the chamber and past the scaffold. The magistrate watched him go and made a note in his book. The courier left the square with his hands in his cloak. The final concrete step was a clerk sealing the ledger with a stamp. He laid the flap and pressed the seal down. Ink pooled at the gilt edge. A hand reached across the desk and slapped closed the book. The scandal would be copied, argued, and argued again, but on that day the immediate conflict had been resolved. The condemned's body was taken away, the dismemberer faced the council, the magistrate kept his office, and the patron's name had been exposed to the air. The narrator recorded the outcome without moralizing. The dismemberer had weighed obedience and craft and chosen craft in a manner that changed the sentence's public face. The magistrate had attempted to reclaim authority and instead ignited faction. The courier's second paper had shifted blame from law to private revenge. The crowd had broken into factions and the nobles had drawn lines. The condemned's body, born under a rough cloth, closed a short, brutal chapter in which private vengeance had tried to masquerade as public justice. A clerk locked the ledger and pushed the key across a table to the magistrate's aid. A silence followed that was not quiet, but full of small movements, the folding of cloaks, the scraping of feet, the lowering of heads. The dismemberer stepped into the rain and did not look back. The magistrate returned to his dais and tore the wax of a fresh seal. The courier departed with a paper folded in his breast. The courtyard held the prints of many feet and a few drops of blood that would be swept later into a drain. The record closed with ink and a sealed hand. The scandal lived on in parchment and rumor. The day ended with a door closed, a clerk stamping a paper, and a dismemberer who walked away from the scaffold into a future counted in council summons and whispered thanks from those who had not yet dared to speak. The chapter concludes with a concrete beat. A cold hand on the bench slid a folded scrap of cloth, the same scrap the dismemberer had pocketed, across the ledger to the clerk. and the clerk slipped it into the file labeled Events of the 5th Month. That gesture sealed what would be read and argued. A tool altered, a writ exposed, and a spectacle that became a stain on the court's ledger.